episode 125, Podcasting for Dummies with Colin Gray, the podcast host.
Welcome to the PR Playbook Podcast, the only podcast giving you actionable skills and advice you need to execute a strategic PR program. Warning: what you hear next may lead to brand awareness and increased sales and customer exposure. Now here's your host, Rinjini Joshua.
Hi, welcome to episode 125. Today we are talking about podcasting. We're podcasting about podcasting. And I have Colin Gray here, the founder of the podcast host and creator of Alitu, a app for podcasting. Hi, Colin. How are you?
Hey, not too bad. How about yourself?
I'm well. I'm excited to talk to you because I love podcasting. And I think a lot of people have this question of like how and why and all those things. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, happy to
so
get into it.
yeah, can you give us a little bit of an intro of how you got into this? When did you start podcasting?
Yeah, I started back in about 2007, 2008-ish. I was teaching at a university in Edinburgh in Scotland. And I was teaching lecturers how to be better with technology to help their students. And podcasting was one of those fancy new technologies that had come along. It was about 3-4 years old at that point, I think. And I was asked to look at it and learn it by my boss, actually. And I did. And I just fell in love with the medium at the time, actually. I loved the kind of the combination of kind of one-to-one, the intimacy that you get listening to someone on a podcast, the feeling that it's much more kind of personal than, video or blogging or anything like that. And it's
Mhm.
just the way that you can go really long form and in depth, and people can talk about someone for an hour, 2 hours, and you can do it while it's like you're wasted time. Otherwise, I just loved that
Right.
whole combination. And so I just went deep on it, started writing a lot about it, learning about all the gear. And the site that came out of that writing was the podcast host, the one that I run these days, the one that's kind of the basis for the business we have now.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the short story into it.
Did you ever get into ASMR with all the podcasting when you're testing all that podcasting gear?
Yeah. No, I've never played around with that, but there's a couple of people in our team have. Yes, absolutely. So it's a very strange approach, isn't it? But yeah, they talk highly of it. Certainly, never tried it myself. Have you?
Well, every time I hear something that's kind of funny like that, it does attract you a little bit. You're like, wow, it
Uh,
just sounds so clear. Like sound
yes.
is it's so impactful and so important. And that's why I like the idea of exploring a different medium than just, writing or just video. I mean, everybody's doing Zoom and webinars or having fatigue. But I think, emerging out of the pandemic, podcast really like kind of took over.
Yeah, I know. It was. I wonder sometimes if it was, everyone has a podcast. It's like everyone has a book in them. This is the modern version of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone's got a podcast in them. They have something they think they can share with the world, and I think everyone does actually have that kind of message inside them to get out. And it's just so much easier to do it with a podcast. But then there was, everyone's a little bit busy. But then there was this point, like a couple of years ago, as we all know, that everyone was suddenly like, "Huh, I've got nothing to do. I'm stuck in the
Yeah.
house. What can I do?" And so everyone got their mic out, and somehow everyone still had a little bit of money to do it with because they weren't going out and spending it on takeaways. And so yeah, there
Right.
was total explosion in it. So it was great. There was a lot of good shows come out at that time, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think I started like right before the pandemic hit in 2019 is when we
Yeah.
started this podcast. And then in later in 2019, I started another podcast. So I did two of them. I've been guest on some podcasts. I mean, it's fun to do and it's also fun to listen to. And it feels
Yeah.
like not a lot of pressure. Like you don't have to be really like committed to the podcast. You can listen to whatever
Yeah.
you want. You can start and stop. So it's really nice. But I do find that it's a great way to kind of share expertise and experience. You can listen to podcasts while you're working out. And I think, when it comes to business podcasts, that's what a lot of people do. They're just trying to like maximize their time and they're usually multitasking when they're listening to a podcast. So I'd love to talk about the reasons why someone would start a podcast as other than, personal entertainment and just kind of, uh, having fun with something new. Why would a business start a podcast? And like, how do you know if you're the right kind of business to start a podcast?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two types of businesses that really benefit from it. I think one is the individual. If you're a consultant, a coach, a mentor, and you're trying to build a personal brand, which really means, I mean, the whole thing behind that is you're wanting people to trust you, isn't it? It's like, how do you convince people to trust that A, you know what you're talking about, you're not an idiot, you're not just making it up as you go along, and B, that you're a decent person, that this person can like and respect and get on with.
Right.
So there's like all that, the trust, credibility, the personality, the ethos behind you, all that stuff. I think that is a perfect avenue for podcasting because, if you think about the alternatives, like blogging's great for all sorts of reasons. You mentioned like talking about all sorts of different contents. I'm sure we'll get into that later, but it's hard to really connect with people in writing. You have to be a good writer to incite emotion, to connect, it just doesn't come very naturally to people in many ways.
Yeah.
Video is a funny one as well. Video gets you closer. You can be maybe yourself to a camera. You can present that way, but so many people get quite nervous on a camera.
Oh yeah. I've seen some pretty bad visuals when it comes
Yeah,
to video.
it's terrible, isn't it? Like you feel there's a sense of real kind of shock when you get in front of a camera and you're staring at this lens and you're like, I'll try and be myself, but no, it's quite difficult.
Yeah.
But when you come to podcasting has two benefits to it, two big benefits. One is that goes away because actually it's so much easier just to speak to a microphone. You don't have to worry about your hair, how you're looking, your lighting, your background, all that stuff. It's just simpler. You can have a script in front of you. So much easier.
Right.
But the other part is just the fact that you get so much more attention because people will listen. Like you're lucky if you can get somebody to watch like 3 minutes of a YouTube video.
Right.
Before they get distracted and go and look at cat videos. But with a podcast, they're listening to you in the car, or like you said, when they're working out or walking the dog, you get people for like an hour. It's crazy how long people listen. So you have that combination of the kind of just the personable nature of you speaking naturally into a mic as if it's to a friend. It feels more one-to-one. It feels really personal. And then you multiply that by that amount of time, like an hour, 2 hours. And that just grows so much credibility, so much trust. It just gets that person to know you so well. And that is such a great way to build that relationship that leads to somebody, liking you and being a fan of your work. And then will buy what you do. So I think that is one area, certainly, like the solopreneur, the kind of single entrepreneur, that kind of thing. That just works so well with podcasting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've listened to a lot of different coaches, or I've even looked for coaches and other people that are featured on different podcasts. So like, I don't know if you've heard Tim Grover, but like he's been interviewed on lots of different podcasts, and I've listened to his interview on different podcasts, and it's different every time. And it's got a different dynamic based on who you're interacting with. So it's just very interesting how the people that you're talking to can change the conversation too.
Yeah. Well, it's because it's so natural, isn't it? You don't have the same conversation with two people, even if you're talking about the same topic. So it's so much more normal and natural. And that, I think, is what helps, the people listening get to know you. And that's what grows the trust because you're not selling to them. You're not marketing. You're not reading a script. You're just being yourself. So I think that's the huge benefit.
So that leads me to that next question that I have is, what makes good content? How do you know what kind of content to carve out for your audience? Because obviously you want to plan this content. I mean, you just don't want to just go into a podcast not knowing what you're going to say, but how do you plan that content out and determine what people are going to listen to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, once you start thinking about a podcast, like how would you come up with the topic? How do you niche it down? Like, how about yourself? Like, look at your example. Like, what was your kind of first idea around the topic you wanted to make your show around?
Well, I mean, I think it's always been the same thing, actually. This podcast came out of frustration. So we work with startups and we work with small businesses as well and entrepreneurs, all kinds of different companies in the PR section. And a lot of people just didn't understand what we did. And so I kind of developed the idea of this podcast based on saying, okay, look, in order for us to even work successfully with people, they have to know what we do. And so it's really a way for them to uncover the nuances of what we do, how we do it, try it themselves, DIY it. And so that's kind of what I wanted to present. And then it evolved to also, hey, this is what this is. So this is how you podcast. This is how you write branded content. these are other experts that kind of talk about it. So, it's not just me talking about it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
other people like vouch
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a good example. Do you know what? I mentioned two ways that podcasting works good for businesses earlier. I mentioned the solopreneur, the person on their own, but that's the other one that I didn't mention, we forgot to get to, was a small business that
Yeah.
is trying to compete with other small businesses or even big businesses. And the way for that business to stand out is to show the people behind it. It's exactly the same principle. It's just that there may be a group of people. It's the team. Like, show the people on the team. Who are these people behind this brand, behind this company front door? And it's so good, like, to be able to get yourself out that way for sure. But when you
Yeah.
talk about the content, so I'm like, so you're talking about PR. Do you have a kind of a specific angle on that, or do you talk about the whole sort of realm of PR?
The whole realm of PR and how you can do it yourself. So
Yeah.
DIY
Okay.
PR
Perfect.
basically, and
Yeah.
the principles that you might want to incorporate if you're trying it for the first time.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's perfect. So you've niched down a little bit. So you've taken your topic, you've got PR, you've thought, right, what's my angle on it? Well, I can teach people how to do it by themselves, save them coming to anyone else. And no doubt they'll end up coming to you anyway when they want the help. So that's really cool. But that's the first part of it for me. And from there, the content planning you mentioned, it's
Mhm.
all about the questions. Like, so people that come to you, your potential clients, anyone that gets in touch with you, what are the first, like, most common 2 or 3 questions that they ask you?
Yeah, of course. So how do you get into the media? That's the
Yep.
first question.
Perfect.
So I think that's probably one of the first questions that I answered.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do you write a press release?
Oh,
So
yeah.
these are,
Yeah.
these
Ideal.
basic questions I kind of started answering. That's exactly how I started the podcast,
Yeah.
with those
Yeah.
basic questions. And then I was able to kind of go into other areas.
Yeah. That's it. That's exactly it. It's questions. It's all about questions. People
Yeah.
overcomplicate it sometimes, but if you're running a business, if you're working with people, you'll get asked questions every single day by those people that are, maybe they're just getting in touch with you for the first time, or maybe they're paying you for a service. They'll be asking you questions. So if you just sit for an hour, you'll be able to write down 20, 30, 40 questions that people ask you all the time. And that
Yeah.
is your content. And the really cool thing is you can then take that and actually create so much more with it. Like the first one you mentioned there, how do I get into the media, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you break that down? Like, what does that sort of break down to? Could it even be different
So
things
the
on media now?
so the first thing would be identifying your goals. Like,
Yep.
why
Yep.
do you want to get into the media?
Sure.
Who's your target audience? And then
Yeah.
identifying the correct media for that target audience. And then how to create a pitch. So that's even
Yeah.
like more podcasts.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Exactly. So by the time you've got what I often recommend people, especially if it's a business podcast, to do is to think up their most favorite question, their most popular question. So maybe that's it. How would you get into the media for you guys? And don't just waste it on one episode. Think,
Yeah.
this is going to be a whole season. This is my first season. So this is going to be 8, 12 episodes. So that's like
Yeah.
2 or 3 months worth of content. And you've just said the first 3 episodes
Yeah.
of that season. So you've
Right.
already got nearly a month's worth of content, and you'll be able to get that extended out to 8, 10, 12 episodes easy.
Right.
And that's a really nice way to start for a lot of businesses, because for a few different reasons, partly because, it's a great way to plan out a few months worth. So that's like a really good basis to make sure that you've got enough content to get started with. If you make that plan, it means that you can start batch recording. Like, you could record 2 or 3 episodes at a time,
Yep.
or at least you can turn up on a Monday morning and say, right, I don't need to think up an idea. I can just sit down, look at my plan, and I can just start recording. So it just makes recording every week really easy too. You also have the fact that, if you get to the end of that season, and as sometimes happens, you think, do you know what? I've enjoyed this, but podcasting's actually not for me. It doesn't fit into my routine. It's not my thing. Even if you decide that, which hopefully you won't, of course, but even if you decide that, you've made something really significant here. You've made like a 3 months worth of content, 12
Content.
episodes that guides someone in a course type format through the most important question that your clients always ask you. You've got that sitting there. You can always send people to.
Yeah.
Somebody's getting in touch. They're asking you a couple of questions. You say to them, well, tell you what, if you're not sure yet, why don't you go and listen to my course here? I've got a
Right.
course, 12 weeks worth, 12 episodes worth, that takes you through how to get into the media. If you like what you hear, we're happy to help you with it. If it doesn't, then hopefully you can go and use it yourself. But either way, hope it helps.
Well, I love that you said that, because I just recorded a podcast talking about optimizing your content. And I mean, that's, again, a lot of people want to marry PR to sales. And that's a great way to marry that, right? It's like, oh, if you have this question, go listen to this episode. We answer it in that episode. And obviously we're talking about my podcast here, but that applies to any area of expertise, any industry. So that's an amazing way to leverage your podcast for business development and lead gen.
Yeah, it's great. I love seasons. Do you know the best thing as well? Like, you know, when you start a podcast and you think, right, I'm going to do a podcast. I'm going to do it on PR. I'm going to do it weekly. I'm not going to do it forever. And you're like, oh, that's quite big.
Well, yeah,
Well, with seasons, at least you've got these forced breaks, I guess. Well, it's not forced breaks, but it's a really kind of natural way to take a break because you
yeah,
record, say, 12 episodes, that's 3 months, and then you take a month off. And there's
yeah.
actually a really natural break there. You say at the end of the season, like, thanks so much for listening through the last 12 episodes where we've covered this whole concept. Hope you really enjoyed it. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back on the 1st of May in 4 weeks' time.
And then there's
And by the way,
anticipation mounting.
yeah, totally. Yeah, you take some time off. You can even use that break to incite a load of feedback. Like you say, while we're away, we'd love to get your feelings on what to do in the next season. Go to blablabla.com/survey and answer a couple of questions, and that'll power our next season. And you can use that really usefully as well. So yeah, I love that format for all sorts of reasons.
So I love this because you're inciting my questions here. So you had mentioned 12 episodes, like for a season. I know you're just kind of putting something random here, but like, how do you know, like, how many episodes? One of the hardest things was getting past episode 25. That was my
Okay.
first goal. I had when we first started a podcast, I had somebody else who started their podcast, completely different topic. She had the goal of getting through her first season. I had that goal of getting through episode 25. So these were different goals, but like and that was really hard because it's like, nobody's listening. You're like, well,
Yeah.
where is everybody? So how do you know if your podcast is successful? What metrics should you make to continue? Like, what should you commit to if you're starting something new?
Yeah, I mean, this is the hard part, isn't it? Because the difficult thing that you have to tell podcasters is that podcasting is a lower audience, like longer term play than most other mediums.
Yeah.
So it's harder to get a podcast listener than it is to get a video watcher or a blog reader because for a few different reasons. One, it's a little bit more niche, as in not everyone even knows like what a podcast is compared to video and blogging.
Right.
Two, it has to be on a certain app. Like you can't, it's harder to go and just browse the web and like find a podcast and listen to it. It's not really the way you should listen because you want to be listening while you're out and about rather than on your computer. And three, they're long. Like it's hard to give people a taste of what your podcast is like and hook them in just a few minutes because a good podcast episode is maybe 20, 30 minutes long or an hour or something.
Yeah.
But the difference is that it's worth it because of all that stuff I talked about earlier. Like the fact that podcasting is the one big way to grow so much trust over time. So if you can convince that person to listen to your podcast, they'll be a fan for life. Whereas somebody goes and reads your blog, then they just disappear, never remember it again. Same with video in many ways. So like if you're thinking about it from a business point of view, one podcast listener to me, in my experience, is worth 100 video watchers, and it's worth 1,000 blog readers because of the conversion. You could have 500 podcast listeners and you could sell half of them on your products and your services because of the trust you're generating. Whereas if you had 500 YouTube watchers, you'd get like one of them to buy something. And if you have 500 blog readers, you get zero, no conversion at all. So it's a harder slog and you have to kind of calibrate your expectations around the numbers a little bit more to say that, if I get 500 or 1,000 listeners to my podcast, that's actually a pretty significant show. That is in the top 50% by a long shot of podcasts. In fact, what were the numbers I saw last? I think it's just in the hundreds still. You can be in the top 10% at something like 400 or 500 listeners. So the top 10% of all podcasts get that. So that's one of the harder things to tell people. But as long as you go into it with those expectations and know that those listeners, like a company like yourself, you don't need big listeners because if you get clients, you only probably work with dozens of clients. It's not hundreds.
Yeah.
So if you can convert dozens of people, then that's all good. So you only need hundreds of people to listen to be able to do that.
Yeah. You have to put it in perspective, right?
Yeah. So hopefully that does put it in perspective for most people.
Okay.
Does that help with you at all? Or
Well, no, I'm on, I'm on
you're past that
125.
now?
Come
Yeah, for
on,
sure.
come on. Oh, so I think that was, you had mentioned frequency. Like, I'm going to do it every
Yeah.
week forever, right? So how do you kind of determine one, the frequency, and then also like, there's some of my podcasts have been like 10, 15 minutes. Some of
Mhm.
them, mostly the interviews are a little bit longer, 40 minutes to an hour.
Yeah.
But how do you determine frequency and how do you determine the length of your podcast?
Yeah. Well, this is the other beauty of podcasting is that you can do whatever the heck you like. And it doesn't have to be the same every time. I I kind of liken it to something. What do I liken it to? I often say that a podcast, it's good to have an average. Okay. So it is good to have a slight expectation for your listeners. They
Mhm.
do like to know this podcast does come out every 2 weeks on a reasonably regular basis. It tends to be about 20 to 30 minutes because if that's the average, they'll kind of know what to expect. But if they
Right.
get to know you and trust you, and you put out a 5 minute episode that gives jam packed value, and that's all you have time for that week, they'll love it. If you put out a 2 hour show, then they'll love it. If you go from 20 minutes every week to an hour every single week, then you might lose a few people who don't have that much time. But if you do it every now and again,
Yeah.
away from your average, it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. So I think it is a bit around the format. It's more about the format in terms of the length. If you can use the format as a uniqueness because maybe a 5 minute like quick tips show every
Sure.
week or
Yes.
every day is actually a unique format that suits your audience. Whereas a once a month absolute deep dive that takes you a day to prepare or something like that is really useful to your audience too. So that's the beauty of it. Again, it's whatever the heck you like and what suits your schedule and the audience that are listening.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also good, like you said, you mentioned surveys earlier, to tap
Yeah.
into your audience to see what they want to hear, especially once you build a little bit of a following, or maybe even talking to your current customers to see what questions they have that they want you
Yeah.
to answer. Because I mean, I think it is valuable to give information that people want as well as
Yeah.
what you think they want, because that could be different sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a lovely way to go about it. If you already have a few customers at least, then start making it for them. They're your ideal listener, aren't they?
Right.
So
Right.
totally ask them the question, ask them what they want to hear. If you make a show that they like and start listening to, then that's the key to getting more people like them, isn't it? I would say. So yeah, it's a
Yeah,
great
but
place to start.
one of the other things I did to generate topics was I started writing down all the questions I had during my sales process. So like
Mm,
the things that
yeah.
people would ask about a proposal. So there's specific areas that they would want clarification on or
Yeah.
expansion on. So those questions were also something that I felt like, oh, that would be good to answer on the podcast. Because one, like you just said, I forgot about this, but you can say, hey, listen to this podcast to get this answer.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
nice.
Love it.
But then also you're answering that same question that probably other people would.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. If one person has it, then everyone has it. That's inevitable for sure. Yeah. Great place to
Yeah.
start.
So, I mean, gosh, there's so many things I think that people worry about. Like one of the things that I worried about when I first started, and then someone told me just do it. It was, getting all the gear. And you talked about when you were doing like all the investigation and it's fun, but it's like a
Mhm.
rabbit hole. It could take you forever if you can't decide on the gear. How do you know what kind of gear to get? Or what's like the most essential thing that you need to have before you start? And then, what are some of the ideal things to have as you say?
Yeah, so many people overcomplicate it. They start thinking like, all right, I'm going to make this sound amazing. I'm going to spend like 500 quid on a
Yeah.
microphone and then I'm going to put it into like £1,000 mixer. And then they get it all set up and they're like, yeah, ready to go. And then they press record and they can't hear a thing because it's so complicated. They don't know
Yeah.
how to make it actually work. There's a switch off here and there's a buzzer off there. It's terrible. So I always say like the thing to do, certainly in the early days, is just keep it as simple as humanly possible.
Mm.
There's essentially two mics that I just always recommend, depending on your budget, and just a USB microphone. Just record into your computer,
Okay.
and they're perfect. And so you've got one which is the Samsung Q2U,
Okay.
which is only about $50, $60. Really nice sounding mic for the price. It's absolutely great considering the low cost of it. And
Right.
the other one's the one speaking into right now, which is the Rode Podcaster,
Wow,
which is
they're
a
really
USB mic. Yeah, it comes with well, you can get a
full
stand and a
stand.
shock
Yeah.
mount and stuff. And it's about, for the whole set, it's about $250, $250. but the sound is great, so reliable, so simple, just works. It's
Mhm.
perfect. How did you go on that? You look like you've got a directional microphone
Yeah,
in
I've
there,
got
have
my
you?
little directional mic. I started with a different microphone and then I realized how terrible it was, but it
Yeah.
wasn't so terrible. I recorded probably the first, year of episodes on that little mic. It was like a little desk stand microphone that I
Oh,
just
yeah,
bought
yeah.
on,
Yeah.
but the sound quality wasn't very good. And we had recorded a second podcast, a totally different topic. And we had been in a professional podcast studio for that one. And when I heard that microphone, I asked my editor, I was like, I need to sound like this. And you could just, I feel like a good microphone is just so worth the investment because the sound is
Yeah.
clear and
Yeah.
just out good. So I just have a mic and a mixer. I keep it easy.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Cool, cool.
yeah,
Yeah, that's what I usually say. Yeah, it's so simple, but you're right. It does make a difference. It's lovely to listen to somebody that's speaking on a good mic, but I'd be careful to say, I don't let it put you off if you don't have
yeah,
one. Like you're saying, you recorded your first year on a really simple little desktop mic, and it might not sound quite as like deep and resonant and everything as a really expensive mic, but if your content's good, if it's resonating with people, just like the content itself, then that's a great way to get
yeah.
started. So yeah, don't
And
let
just
it
to
put you
get
off if you don't.
comfortable with
Yeah,
doing it.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
try
But
it out.
it is a little awkward talking to yourself for a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit.
Well, I guess that's another question I could bring up is just how do you know if you're talking to yourself or you're talking to other people?
Well, so there's a few things here. Yeah, people often feel a bit awkward at that at first. I like a couple of silly, weird little tricks here, which do actually work. One is, the kind of obvious one is to think your ideal listener. So you're talking about customers there
Mhm.
earlier on.
Yes.
Like, actually think about that actual physical person and speaking to them as if it's a conversation. Like,
Mhm.
put them in your head and pretend you're speaking directly to them. And the sillier tricks that work for me here is you can, if you're doing a solo show, take a photo and put it on the wall. And it feels like you're speaking to that actual person. And the slightly weirder one, but actually I've seen it work as well, is get like a teddy bear or something like that, put it on a chair right in front of you. And it starts to feel so weirdly natural speaking to this teddy bear as if it's a real human being after a little while.
Yeah,
But it
we
does,
become
it
your
kind of,
best friend.
yeah, it breaks that little strangeness around just speaking to a little bit of electronic equipment. It puts something there that you can kind of personify with your listener, and it makes a difference.
Right. So have you done a lot of, I'm guessing you have interviews.
Yep.
And how do you choose? I mean, I know how I choose an interviewer, but how would you choose? Like, let's say I wanted to incorporate interviews into my podcast. How do you choose the right interviewer to go with you?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I always think problem first. So you know those questions we're talking about earlier. I
Yes.
always think there's too many people choose people because of, their title or maybe something they've done before, and often that takes you down a road where you end up with these people that either your listener has heard say their general stuff like a dozen times before because they're relatively well known in that space, or this person is high enough level that maybe they're a bit bored with all this kind of thing and they'll just give you the kind of rope party line and stuff like that. I actually
Right.
find some of the most interesting, great people to interview are far less well known. They're far earlier on their journey. They've still got experience to know like some great stuff, but they've got some more innovative, crazy ideas. They've got some
Right.
different ideas. And what I often do is I think about those problems. So you have your list of 20 or 30 questions and you just start typing them into Google or Twitter or any social media, and you start finding people that have answered them or have
Talking about it.
mentioned them or
Okay.
exactly. And you can find some really nice angles on those questions that way to find these people. And then what you do is you actually just interview them, you ask them the questions, you make sure you get a really interesting angle, and you put that in the title of the episode. You don't put their name because actually, unless you have like the most famous person ever,
Right.
and the
It doesn't
name and
matter.
the title of the episode, no, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
It's all about the problem and the angle you take on solving it. So I like that approach to finding the right people.
Yeah, I remember, I think after, a certain number of episodes, people started reaching out to be on the
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is so exciting. People are reaching out to me. I'm just going to put them on the podcast. But after a while, I realized, like, why am I interviewing this person? I don't really like, that's not what I would normally do. And so
Yeah.
I think I just got excited to the fact that I could tell people were listening or watching or doing something. And so started accepting them, but then realizing, wait a minute, this doesn't suit my podcast. It's not actually a fit. I'm just doing it. And so now I'm a lot more particular about how I choose guests and why I'm choosing it. So like, podcasting is a great topic for us because I'm talking about diversifying content. So having you here to talk about that makes sense for my listeners. But, having someone who wrote a book who just wants to be on a podcast doesn't always make sense. And I know there's so many podcast booking services out there now. And I kind of often wonder, like, did you read what this podcast is about? Because your person doesn't really fit.
Yeah, no, we get that all the time. Like there's one of our shows, we do a show called Podcraft, which is about how to podcast. So it's
Okay.
specifically about how to podcast. And it's just me and Matthew on my team that
Uh-huh.
chat every week. That's all we ever do. We never do interviews. And we
Okay.
still get so many emails that get in touch and say, hello, I would like to talk to you about your Podcraft, podcast, which I know you do interviews on. Could we come and do an interview on it? I'm like, no, you've not even looked at
So
it.
you've already listened to the
Yeah,
podcast.
exactly.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's so funny. Podcast problems. You've given us a lot of tips actually already. But I think maybe as someone is getting started, what do you think are kind of maybe the three or four most important things for them to remember as they get going? And then I want to talk about Alitu a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I suppose that kind of ties in at that point. Like
Yeah.
once you really start, one of the biggest things that I think can benefit any podcaster, I'd love to hear if you have this experience as well, is the whole mindset around really making sure you're not going overboard on editing. Because that's the thing that kills so many
Agreed.
podcasts, is that they edit too much. They take on way too much learning around the kind of technology behind audio, like almost try to become an audio engineer. I get it's similar to the gear, isn't it? You worry about the audio quality, so you feel like you need to learn the terms equalization and compression and noise reduction and all these things. It's crazy. But there's so much you can do to reduce that. I mean, I'll say like Ality was a tool that we developed because the biggest problem we always heard about from our readers was editing. They hated the amount of time that they had to spend on editing. So
Yeah.
even the simple fact that we've built noise reduction in there and leveling, and we've got things in there like a bit of auto EQ as well to make your voice sound better. So you don't have to worry about any of the audio cleanup stuff because so much tech can do that nowadays. Like it's not just Ality, there's other tech out there that can do exactly the same thing. So there's no need for you now to learn those audio engineering things. So that's one of the first things to remember. You're not getting into podcasting to become an audio engineer.
Right.
Certainly not if you're a business.
Right.
So let tools like Ality or like whatever else do that stuff for you.
Mhm.
The other one is the editing itself. So cutting out mistakes. Like how much do you do in that sense? Like do you cut out a lot of stuff to your shows? From your shows?
No, I'm very holistic, I guess. He just cuts out some of the ums and the silent
Yeah.
spaces because sometimes I'm
Yeah.
thinking before I speak, and so there might be a pause. So
Yeah.
he does very little editing for me, and it's just like kind of just cleaning it up a bit, like you
Little
said,
cleanup.
making it sound better.
Yeah.
And then if we mess up, then he like
Yeah.
fixes it. But that's the only time, and we barely messing up requires a huge mess up for me to even pull him to edit.
That's it. Exactly. You hit the absolute nail on the head. That's why I say to people, it's like so if you can try and get yourself into a live recording mindset, as if you're live on the radio
Right.
and you're thinking, right, I'm going to hit record and this is me. I'm live on the radio. I can't change a thing. If I mess something up, I'm just going to say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that. That was a total mistake. This is what I meant. And you don't have to go back and edit it. I mean, the only stuff that we go back and edit these days is if it's something entirely wrong, like if it's a total wrong link or URL or something you're really trying to send somebody to, or if it's like, if you come out in a coughing fit or something like that,
Right.
you'll edit that out. And that's what, like Ality is good for that. It lets you cut out any mistakes like that. But then any other editing package can do the same thing. So you can do that with whatever you do. But the key part is try and do as little of that as you can by trying to stay in that live recording mindset. Because if you do that, then it just means that the post-production part, so once you've recorded, then you do a little tiny edit to clean up, and then you've got it published, and that's it, done.
Done.
It doesn't kill the show. It's so good. So yeah, and there's one little trick I can share actually in terms of the editing too. It works really well with any editing package, but Ality's set up for it too. If you do make a mistake that you totally have to change, whether it's a coffin fit or whether it's like just something you could have done better potentially, Then just while you're speaking, then you just pause after the mistake, a little bit of silence, and then you just click 3 times into the microphone with your tongue, and then
Mhm.
pause again afterwards, and then you can start speaking again. And that shows up really, really clearly on the timeline. So when you're doing a podcast,
Oh, a pause
you've
and then a
yeah,
sound.
yeah. So you've recorded, say, 60 minutes. The
Mhm.
thing that kills a lot of shows is that people will listen to every single one of those minutes.
Right.
And you know what? It's worth saying, it is worth listening to some of your episodes from time to time because it's a way to improve. It's a way to hear your speaking style, like if you're using crutch words, things like that. So it is worth listening to your episodes. But if you listen to every minute of every episode you record, that is onerous. That is like a lot of time.
Yes.
But instead with this, you can skim through a 20-minute episode. You can, like an reality window, you can grab the little scroll, you can zoom in a little bit to maybe see a minute, and then you can grab the little scroll bar and just drag it right and look for these little spikes. And those little clicks show up really clearly because you've got an empty space either side and then three little spikes.
I'm
And
gonna
you can
use
just
that. I'm
you can
gonna
just
use
drag
that.
a little window
Great.
across it, get rid of them, and it's done. Yeah. So
Yeah,
there's 3 things.
that's a great tip. I love it. I was just thinking of something as you were speaking about editing and fixing things. Gosh, what was it? I think it was just about, you know, not editing or not over editing
Mhm,
makes it
mhm.
also sound just more natural. Like again, like if you're talking to a teddy bear, you wouldn't you wouldn't edit that out. You would just say, "Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
teddy bear." Like I didn't mean to say that. So
Exactly. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
does make it sound a little bit more like a conversation and more
Yeah.
natural. I think people can appreciate that too.
I totally agree. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like we said earlier, your whole goal with a podcast is to humanize the people behind your brand or your company or whatever, isn't it? So to humanize it, you need to sound human, and we all make mistakes as humans. So yeah, if you polish it up too much, it can sound a bit too like radio like. There's a funny thing when you're podcasting. I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but like if you listen to the radio, you can sometimes kind of, because they've done so much and so practiced, they can sound almost non-human because they're so kind of perfect, almost
Right.
in many ways, presenters. And if you listen to an audiobook, the reason an audiobook is often a little bit boring to listen to is because it's just too perfect.
Oh
It's
my
just
god.
like read
But
it. You know?
it depends on who you get to narrate it.
Well,
I
true, true. Yeah, you
but
get good
I've heard
narrators.
both a very entertaining one, and I've heard another one that was, like, so dry that I fell asleep. It was just dirt dry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
I
you're right. You want that humanity in there for sure.
Yeah, I think another thing to note is also, like, if you're starting to podcast and you're not familiar with it, it's actually a really great media training tool because it
Mhm.
does help you reduce the number of ums that you say. It does help you take pauses. As you record, you start
Yeah,
noticing yourself the things
yeah,
that you do when you're speaking. And I found myself slowing down and thinking a little bit more about what I'm going to say so that maybe my editor doesn't have to edit as much
yeah,
or that I know that I'm not making as many mistakes. And so that actually I think it helps you speak better even if it's in a meeting or if it's hopefully in a media interview and you have
yeah.
one. And I think that also is a great way. Like, back in, I don't know, I'm going to say back in the day, I don't know what day, but like Toastmasters was a huge thing, right? And like
Mm.
everybody
Yep.
would do Toastmasters to get that professional speaking training. And I don't think this is that equivalent, but it is like a nice tool to kind of help you brush up on your speaking skills too.
It totally is. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think that's another benefit of that kind of live recording mindset too, because you stop trying to use editing as a crutch and it
Right.
forces you to improve. It forces you to notice the ums and the ahs and the crutch words and the fact that you say basically every other sentence or something like that. And it just makes you improve them. So instead of spending like 2 hours every episode editing out all your ums, just spend an hour listening and then an hour practicing
Yeah.
speaking and taking a breath instead of saying or just taking your time for sure. It helps
Yeah,
you
I
so much
love
more.
that. Well, I want to get into a little bit about Alitu before we end this. So you've mentioned it, there's a lot of tools, but let's talk about this particular tool because it sounds like you guys have a lot of features and I had never heard of it before, but I want to try it. So what can you do with your app?
Yeah, I mean, it's an all-in-one podcasting app these days. So it does have call recording in there, solo recording. So you can get your material in there in the first place, run your calls in there if you want to. You can upload recordings from anywhere. So we're recording in Google Meet just now, for example. You'll be able to upload that to Alitu if you want to, or from Zoom or for wherever. Then the cleanup happens. So it does the noise reduction, the leveling, the audio EQ, makes you sound good, all that stuff. So you don't have to worry about a thing. And then we've got our episode builder. And that's where you can piece together all the bits. So you can upload your interview in there, for example, and you could record an intro to that interview in automatically. You could, I think you do a little kind of bumper before, don't you? So you could chop that off and put it before the music. Yeah. So you can do that. It's a drag and drop kind of block based interface for putting together all the elements of your podcast. And you could put in like musical transitions, or it adds your music in there automatically as well if you've got theme music.
Do you have access to music through the app?
Yep. Yeah, we've got a music library in there, and it's got packs of music. So you get a few different intros, some transitions over a few seconds, and a loop that you can use that are all themed. So you can sound all really polished. And yeah, the last couple of things, I suppose, we've got the editor. So you can cut out your mistakes, split any clips in there, and then the hosting at the end as well. So that helps you publish your show. So you can publish it straight out to the web and to the public. And there's, I suppose, there's transcripts. You can get your transcripts in there for the whole episode, and create a video version of it too if you want to.
What's your, are you, okay, I'm making this up, and so you might not have this feature, but
Sure.
you can edit your episode. Can you make snippets of the episode as well?
You can certainly start. We don't have that in as a kind of automated tool or anything yet, but you can certainly take one of your recordings from your library and chop it down to like a certain section and then export that on its own. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like I just made that feature up, but
yeah, it's a great idea. And it's something we want to build in, whereby you can actually like select 2 or 3 bits of an existing episode and we'll automatically export them for you. So that's like that's a future thing for us. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, great. Live feedback for the app. I haven't even used yet. It sounds great. And then you guys publish to all the different platforms, obviously, then.
Yeah, we can link out to most of the popular podcast hosts, or you can download the episode direct and put it wherever you like as well.
Okay. Okay, cool. Anything else we should know about just podcasting that we haven't touched on that I haven't asked?
Do you know what? Usually I have something to say at the end that somebody's missed, but you've actually been really, really thorough. So yeah, I mean, the big things are the simplicity, that live recording mindset as well, to cut down on the editing. They're really, the things that we see kill shows more often than not. It's about that time spent faffing around with equipment or messing around too much in editing. If you can avoid those, it means you can spend like twice as much time on planning out great content, on talking to your listeners, on creating more great content that they actually want to hear. Like you mentioned that earlier, isn't it? Like knowing what they want to hear, not just what we want to talk about. And that is what grows a successful show compared to, a show that just languishes on with 20 listeners for the rest of its life.
Right. Well, you never know. Those could be your 20 best friends at the end of the day.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. I shouldn't say that because if you're a company that sells like an individual that sells like £10,000, consulting packages, you only need 10 of those to buy it, and then you're in the money.
So tell everybody where we can find you, where we can find Alitu, and obviously this will be in the show notes. But yeah, tell us where we can find you.
Thanks very much. Probably the best place if you're thinking about starting a podcast is we've got a big guide on our content site, which is over at thepodcasthost.com/start. And if you want to give Alitu a shot, we'd love to have you. It's got a 7-day free trial, so you can try it out and see if it suits you. It's over at alitu.com, which is ALITU.com.
Great. Thank you, Colin. It's been so nice to talk to a fellow podcaster.
Indeed. It's always good to talk to any podcasters about podcasting. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. All right, guys. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, of course, you can contact Colin or me, Ranjini, at thesilvertelegram.com. We will see you next time.